Hello there, I'm Neil Ronahan, Director of NintendoWorldReport.com, and welcome to Rare 64, a look back at the storied Nintendo 64 output of one of Nintendo's most notable second parties, the British developer Rare. Up first is Killer Instinct Gold, the 1996 sequel to the arcade/Super Nintendo fighter Killer Instinct. But before we get to the early N64 game, we have to go back a few years. After all, the original Killer Instinct's origins are tied very closely to the Nintendo 64. Even though it first launched in 1994, it appeared in arcades, Super Nintendo, and even Game Boy before coming to the N64. In early 1994, Nintendo teamed up with Midway to create arcade games that were based on Nintendo 64 tech, which was being referred to as Project Reality at the time. One of the early fruits of Nintendo and Midway's joint venture was Killer Instinct, an arcade game that actually didn't even run on Nintendo 64 hardware. Instead, it ran on hardware made by Midway and Rare. Still, the intention was to bring Killer Instinct to Nintendo 64 in 1994. The arcade game was made, it came out in arcades, and then, well, it was still 1994 and the Nintendo 64 wasn't out yet, as it was delayed ultimately all the way to 1996. With no shiny new system on the horizon to make the game for, the small team of less than 10 at Rare instead focused on bringing the fighting game to Super Nintendo and Game Boy in 1995. The release of that pair of games was essentially a stopgap to keep the series going while they waited for the N64 to launch. Since the arcade game was built for the Nintendo 64, the Super Nintendo and Game Boy versions lost a bit in translation. The Super Nintendo version featured a large visual downgrade, with about 80% of the animation being dropped. The Game Boy version understandably suffered even more, as it removed characters and simplified the controls to fit the system. Still, the Super Nintendo version was well received and very successful at the time, even if it lost a lot of the arcade magic in the process. With the success of the arcade and console versions, Rare went to work on a sequel that hit arcades in 1996 under the name Killer Instinct 2. Following that, a Super Nintendo and a Nintendo 64 version of the sequel were both in development. The Super Nintendo version, which was nearly finished, ended up getting shelved for some of the same reasons as Star Fox 2. Essentially, Nintendo just wanted to focus on the wow factor of the Nintendo 64's 3D graphics, and not confuse the public with these shiny, gorgeous Super Nintendo games. Shortly after the Nintendo 64's September 1996 launch, that wow factor sort of came to fruition. Killer Instinct Gold, a modified version of the arcade sequel, came out on November 25, 1996. Sadly, Gold suffered some downgrades because of the gaps between Midway and Rare's arcade hardware and the Nintendo 64. The main difference being a lack of storage space on the N64. The arcade machine had a hard drive that stored about 200 frames of background art that was rendered out. In the N64 version, the backgrounds were rebuilt as simpler 3D models. Gold did still run at 60 frames per second, and it did add some new features. There's the training mode, which is useful for learning the ins and outs of the games, including combo breakers. There's team battles, team elimination battles, and tournaments. It also featured some additional content in the form of unlockable character colors. Killer Instinct Gold did not sell nearly as well as the original, pushing only about 1 million copies worldwide, paling in comparison to the 5 million worldwide sales of the Super Nintendo version. The team at Rare, headed by Chris Tilston, worked on a prototype for Killer Instinct 3 in the late 1990s for the N64. The concept was to have fully 3D characters on a 3D background. According to Tilston, it was looking decent. It got hung up in management though, as some felt it was too close to the previous Killer Instincts. Development was eventually halted when the team was pulled to work on Perfect Dark. The series finally came back after many years of teasing as an Xbox One launch title developed by Double Helix. Currently, Iron Galaxy Studios is working on the second season of content for the fighter. But as for Rare and the Nintendo 64, they were just getting started. Next time on Rare 64, we start blowing stuff up in Blast Core.
Continue.